By the middle of the 14th century, the ordinary rhythms of life across Europe had begun to fracture in ways no one could fully understand. In towns and villages, people who had risen at dawn to tend fields or trade goods were, within days, gone. Not in ones or twos, but in numbers so large that entire communities fell silent. Roads emptied. Bells tolled without pause. And in 1349, the crisis reached its peak when across vast stretches of the continent, whole villages vanished from record, their names preserved only in tax rolls that would never again be updated. The catastrophe that came to define this period had not begun in Europe. Its origins lay further east, likely in Central Asia, where the bacterium responsible, now known as Yersinia pestis, circulated among rodent populations. Trade routes that connected distant regions carried more than goods. By the 1340s, the disease had traveled along the Silk Road, reaching ports of the Black Sea. From there, merchant ships carried it westward, unknowingly transporting infected fleas and rats into Mediterranean harbors. By 1347, the first major outbreaks appeared in southern Europe, including Sicily and parts of Italy. Within months, the disease spread rapidly along established trade networks. Ports became entry points, and from them, infection moved inland along roads and rivers. Europe at the time was densely interconnected through commerce, pilgrimage, and warfare. These same connections allowed the disease to move with extraordinary speed. The early symptoms were alarming but not immediately understood. Individuals developed fever, weakness, and painful swellings, often in the groin, armpits, or neck. Mortality was high, and death could come within days. Without knowledge of bacteria or transmission, explanations varied widely. Some attributed the illness to corrupted air, others to divine punishment. Medical theory, still grounded in ancient frameworks, struggled to explain the scale and speed of the outbreak. By 1348, much of southern and western Europe was affected. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London experienced repeated waves of infection. Yet it was in 1349 that the cumulative impact became most visible. The disease had spread northward and inland, reaching regions that had initially been spared. England, parts of Germany, and Scandinavia saw widespread outbreaks. Rural areas, often assumed to be safer due to lower population density, proved vulnerable as well. In many villages, the arrival of the disease followed a similar pattern. A traveler or returning resident would fall ill. Within days, others in the household showed symptoms. Soon, neighbors were affected. With limited understanding of contagion, few effective measures were taken to isolate the sick. As deaths mounted, normal systems of care and burial broke down. Contemporary records, though incomplete, offer glimpses into these moments. Parish registers show sudden drops in baptisms and marriages. Tax documents list settlements that ceased to contribute entirely. In some cases, entire communities disappeared from administrative records after 1349, suggesting that they were either abandoned or left with too few survivors to function as organized settlements. The scale of mortality remains difficult to quantify precisely, but historians estimate that between one-third and one-half of Europe's population may have died during the broader pandemic. In certain regions, losses were even higher. The year 1349 stands out not because it marked the beginning, but because it represented the point at which the cumulative effects reached their most devastating extent across multiple regions simultaneously. The social consequences were immediate and profound. Labor shortages disrupted agricultural production. Fields went unplanted, and harvests were reduced. In many places, land was left fallow not by choice, but because there were too few people to work it. Survivors found themselves in a transformed economic landscape. With labor in short supply, wages in some areas began to rise, challenging existing feudal structures. Authorities attempted to respond, often by trying to stabilize wages and restrict movement. In England, for example, laws were introduced to limit laborers' demands for higher pay. These measures reflected concern among landowners and governments about maintaining traditional hierarchies. However, enforcement was uneven, and long-term shifts in labor relations continued to develop. Urban centers faced different challenges. High mortality affected not only laborers but also skilled artisans, merchants, and officials. Administrative functions were disrupted. In some cities, governance structures had to be temporarily reorganized as officials died or fled. Trade declined sharply in affected areas, though it did not cease entirely. Over time, commerce adapted, but the immediate impact was severe. Religious institutions also played a central role during the crisis. Clergy were often called upon to provide last rites and comfort to the dying. This placed them at high risk, and many died as a result. In some regions, shortages of clergy led to the ordination of less experienced individuals. The inability of the Church to prevent or fully explain the disaster contributed, in some cases, to shifts in religious attitudes. At the same time, the period saw the emergence of various responses rooted in faith. Some communities organized processions or acts of penance, believing the disease to be a form of divine judgment. Others sought explanations in astrological events or environmental changes. Without a unified understanding, interpretations varied widely across regions. The psychological impact of the pandemic is harder to measure but can be inferred from surviving accounts. Writers of the time describe fear, uncertainty, and a breakdown of familiar social bonds. In some cases, individuals avoided contact even with family members. In others, there are reports of communities attempting to maintain routines despite the ongoing threat. It is also important to note that the crisis did not affect all groups equally. Marginalized communities, including certain religious minorities, were sometimes blamed for the spread of the disease. This led to episodes of persecution in parts of Europe. These actions were not based on evidence but reflected broader social tensions that were intensified by the crisis. By the end of 1349, in many regions, the initial wave of the pandemic had begun to subside. This did not mean the disease had disappeared. Recurring outbreaks would continue for decades. However, the peak years had passed, leaving behind a continent that had been fundamentally altered. The demographic changes had lasting effects. With fewer people, land became more available. In some areas, peasants gained greater access to resources and improved living conditions. This shift contributed, over time, to changes in the structure of rural society. Feudal obligations weakened in certain regions, though the process was gradual and varied widely. Economic patterns also evolved. The reduction in population led to changes in demand for goods and services. Some industries declined, while others adapted to new conditions. Urban centers, though initially weakened, eventually recovered and continued to play a central role in trade and governance. Culturally, the experience of widespread mortality influenced art, literature, and religious thought. Themes of mortality and the transience of life became more prominent. While these developments unfolded over time, they can be traced, in part, to the collective experience of the mid-14th century. From a medical perspective, the pandemic exposed the limitations of contemporary knowledge. Although effective treatments were not developed at the time, the scale of the crisis eventually contributed to gradual changes in approaches to public health. In later centuries, responses to disease would increasingly involve measures such as quarantine and improved sanitation, informed in part by earlier experiences. Looking back at 1349, it stands as a moment when the accumulated impact of the Black Death became unmistakable across Europe. The disappearance of entire villages was not an isolated phenomenon but part of a broader pattern of disruption that affected every level of society. Fields, homes, and institutions were left without those who had sustained them. Yet the story does not end solely with loss. The aftermath of the pandemic set in motion a series of changes that would shape European history in the centuries that followed. Population decline altered economic relationships. Social structures adapted under new pressures. Institutions, though strained, evolved in response to challenges they had not previously encountered. The events of 1349 serve as a reminder of how interconnected societies can amplify both growth and vulnerability. Trade routes that had brought prosperity also facilitated the spread of disease. Communities that depended on shared labor and cooperation found those systems tested under extreme conditions. In the years that followed, Europe did not return to its previous state. Instead, it entered a period of transformation. The legacy of the Black Death can be seen not only in demographic records but in the gradual reshaping of economic, social, and cultural life. The silence that settled over abandoned villages in 1349 was not permanent, but it marked a turning point. In that silence, the structures of the past were disrupted, and the foundations of a different future began to emerge.